Tonight, we begin with a brushstroke, not of beauty, but of suspicion. A slender line of ink, dark as oath blood, trailing from the tip of a quill held too delicately to belong to a man. It winds its way through vellum, like a serpent through underbrush, island, intricate, and unseen by the world beyond the scriptorium's walls. But someone saw it, and someone feared it. Before we go any further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly find value in the forgotten corners of history, where silence often speaks loudest. Let me know gently in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your world? I find it comforting, almost sacred, to know that across time zones and seasons, strangers gather here to remember what was almost lost. So dim your lights, perhaps light a candle or turn on a fan for that soft nocturnal hush, because this story begins not in fire, but in ink. In medieval Europe, the most dangerous thing a woman could hold wasn't the blade. It was a pen, or, more precisely, a quill. A single feather, dried and sharpened, its point dipped in iron gall ink, a mixture so acidic it could etch its way into vellum and soul alike. To write was an act of power. To illustrate was to flirt with creation itself. And for a woman, to do either was, quite often, to invite accusation. We like to imagine that witches were born in forests, dancing by moonlight, whispering in circles, bones in their hair and secrets on their tongues. But many of them were born in ink, sitting at desks, cloaked in habit or silence, their hands moving steadily over parchment in cool, stone rooms. They copied gospels, they illuminated saints, and sometimes, when no one was looking, they drew things no one expected. Little grotesques in the margins, toothy beasts chewing on monks' robes, tiny nuns with foxtails, demons with women's hips and ink-smudged fingers, a pig riding a bishop, an owl with a crown, a devil with the face of your abbot. All of it drawn small, all of it nestled in the corners, as if the page itself were whispering something unsanctioned. And for a time, no one paid much attention. After all, what harm could possibly come from a scribbled beast with a forked tongue licking the hem of revelation? But someone was watching. Someone always was. Let us step, gently now, into a scriptorium. It is the 13th century, a convent in northern France. The air smells of dust and melted wax. The walls are pale with cold, but the room is warm with breath and quiet labor. Dozens of women sit hunched over desks, nuns, mostly, though some have come here not for God, but for literacy, for access to the books no one else will teach them. The scribes are focused, their minds humming with Latin and silence. But one woman, perhaps younger than the rest, or simply less devout, she is drawing. Not the holy figures she was instructed to sketch, not quite. She is embellishing. She adds a curve to the Virgin's robe, a wry smile to Saint Margaret. She hides a serpent's head in the folds of Gabriel's wing. And in the margin, in ink so fine it looks like smoke, she draws a devil, not monstrous, not grotesque, almost human. And that, more than anything, is the problem. In the medieval mind, drawing was not innocent. To depict a thing was to name it. To name it was to summon it. And to summon it was to risk inviting it in. There were rules, rigid ones, about how saints could be portrayed. about what angels looked like, about what colors could be used for robes, halos, and skin. There were guides about how much breast the Virgin Mary could show before the image tipped from miraculous to erotic. There were debates, centuries long, about whether it was appropriate to depict God at all. And beneath those debates, there was fear, not of what art might reveal, but of who might be revealed through art. Especially if that artist bled every month and dared to think women illustrators existed, not in myth, in record. Some were cloistered nuns who illustrated psalters and gospel books. Others were laywomen hired for their skill, or noble women who trained in illumination as a form of piety. But their names were rarely written down, and when they were often erased later by men who thought anonymity safer. Not safer for the women, safer for the books. A woman's hand, it was believed, could never be fully still. It trembled with Eve. It tempted. It could not be trusted with lines meant to hold scripture. And if a devil found his way into the margins, if a beast crept onto the page, well, surely it was not an accident. Surely someone meant for him to be there. And surely that someone had breasts. There is a phrase that echoes through inquisitorial records, soft as a curse. She drew the devil, not that she worshipped him, not that she summoned him, but that she drew him. And somehow, that was worse. Because it meant she knew what he looked like. Because it meant she had seen him. Or, God forbid, imagined him. And to imagine the devil, to construct him from ink and thought, was to partake in a kind of unholy authorship. A woman imagining evil was far more dangerous than a man doing so, because men were expected to think. Women, if they thought at all, were expected to pray. The church often tolerated female scribes when they stayed within the lines, literally and theologically. But when their illuminations grew bold, when a demon had too much personality, when a saint looked too alive, whispers began. Some believed that the women were not drawing devils from imagination, that they had seen them, spoken with them, consorted, that their brushes were possessed, that their inks were spells, and that in every tail curled in a margin, in every claw, every smirk, the devil himself was teaching them to draw. This is not metaphor. There are records, many, of women interrogated for artwork, not only accused of heresy, but of illustration. The wrong kind of illustration. One woman, known only as Agnès, was brought before an inquisitorial panel in Rouen in 1473. She had drawn what appeared to be a naked figure, half human, half goat, reclining beneath a tree. The drawing was in the corner of a devotional book she had copied by hand. She said it was Adam in Eden. They said it was Baphomet. She was burned. So we begin this story not with witches. Not yet. We begin with women who dared to pick up the tools of creation, pens, pigments, silence, and use them to make meaning, to interpret, to record, to imagine. And in doing so, they crossed a line they were never meant to see. A brushstroke of blame became a bonfire, and the devil, whether real or not, was watching from the margins, sometimes smiling, sometimes weeping, always drawn by a hand they were too afraid to name. We'll go deeper soon, into the pigments they weren't allowed to touch, into the saints they painted too beautifully, into the trials where drawings became confessions. But for now, let the ink dry. Let the dust settle. And remember, The first accusation was not spellcraft. It was art. There are places in medieval manuscripts where the world begins to unravel, slowly, almost politely. Places where angels give way to animals wearing mitres, where saints drift into scrollwork, and then, just there, beneath the hem of a blessing, a beast grins. He is small. He is strange. He is not supposed to be there. And yet, he is, smiling with too many teeth, peeking from the corner like he's always known you'd find him, like he's been watching the entire time. This is marginalia, the sacred scribbles that decorate the edges of medieval manuscripts. And it is here, at the periphery of scripture and scholarship, that the devil often waits. Not in full form, not with horns and brimstone, but in feathers, fangs, tails, and jest. Sometimes comical, sometimes erotic, sometimes, if you look too closely, uncomfortably familiar. And while men may have penned the Gospels, the margins, they belong to someone else. Let's begin not in fire or fear, but in absurdity. A 14th century psalter from England contains, alongside its Latin prayers, a series of illustrations so strange they border on surreal. A rabbit jousts with a snail. A monkey plays the bagpipes. A bishop is devoured by a fish wearing a crown. All in the margins. None with explanation. These weren't careless additions. They were deliberate, crafted with gold leaf, vivid pigment, and steady hands. And very likely, some by women. In monastic scriptoria across Europe, women were trained not only to copy texts, but to illuminate them. In convents, particularly in France, Germany, and parts of northern Italy, women created exquisite visual accompaniments to scripture. They painted Christ. They painted Mary. And then, when the supervision softened, they painted jokes. They painted animals doing human things. They painted devils dancing with nuns. They painted the truth, hidden sideways. Not openly, never openly. Always in the margins. The edge of the page. The threshold between what was allowed and what was real. In theory, marginalia served a purpose. It helped guide the reader's eye. It broke up dense text. It gave the weary scribe a brief moment of creative reprieve. But over time, these margins became something else. Not just decorations, but declarations. They became places where the unspoken could live, where dissent could hide behind whimsy. It was a kind of coded language. After all, a nun couldn't say that the bishop was corrupt, but she could draw a pig in ecclesiastical robes. She couldn't write that the monastery was crumbling under hypocrisy, but she could sketch a rabbit dragging a cart of skulls through the cloister garden. She couldn't speak of lust, but she could draw a monkey spanking a goose. And in that visual mischief, something sacred happened. A release, a resistance, a tiny, visual prayer for freedom. Of course, not everyone found this amusing, especially when the artist's hand was suspected to be female. Because when men drew demons, it was theological, a lesson, a warning. But when women did it, it was different. It was personal. It was dangerous. Why would a woman imagine such things? How could she know what a devil's tongue might look like? What possessed her to draw breasts on a demon? What possessed her? Full stop. The church did not like unanswered questions, and a woman with a brush was full of them. Take the Smithfield Decretals, a 14th century English manuscript. It contains church law, dry, rigid, and inflexible. But the margins? They are filled with grotesques. Frogs with axes, a nun milking a dog, a knight pursued by a giant snail. The absurdity is striking, but so is the detail. These weren't haphazard doodles. They were labors of attention, of obsession. Scholars have long debated who made these. Some point to male scribes, jesters with quills, but others quietly, insistently suggest the presence of women, trained in the same techniques, equally skilled, but marginalized both in life and on the page. So they took to the margins and left themselves there. Let us pause for a moment on that snail, the most baffling, recurring creature in medieval marginalia. You'll find it again and again. A snail with a shell too large. A snail attacking a knight. A snail crowned like a king. No one agrees on what it means. Some say it represents sin. Others, cowardice, or resurrection, or taxes, or perhaps it doesn't mean anything. Perhaps it was simply the quiet laughter of someone who had no other voice. Perhaps a woman, tasked with copying the words of men, chose instead to draw a creature that made no sense and let it crawl across the page like a secret. There is power in nonsense. There is power in making people ask why. And there is even more power in refusing to answer. The church, however, did not share this philosophy. It liked the meaning. Clear, sanctioned, male meaning. And so the more expressive the margins became, the more uncomfortable the authorities grew, especially when those margins featured the feminine. In a Florentine breviary dated 1324, a woman, perhaps a nun, drew a series of miniature devils. They had breasts, they had hips, they were laughing, and they were, unmistakably, dancing. It was not seductive, it was not obscene, but it was irreverent, and that was enough. The manuscript was confiscated. The name of the scribe was scratched out. Her drawings were inked over, but not well. And if you hold the pages to the light, you can still see the devils. This became the pattern. Erase, redact, replace. But the margins refused to stay empty. They were too good at remembering. Even when women were banned from formal scriptoriums, even when their names were struck from colophons, even when pigments were locked behind monastery doors, still the drawings emerged, tucked into hymnals, etched into woodcuts, painted onto linen slips. The devil at the edge of the page, always just barely visible, always a little too knowing, and often, just often enough, female. This wasn't just art, it was testimony, because to draw a devil was to say, I know he exists. I know what he looks like. And worse, I know what he wants. Which begs a question that terrified the medieval mind. Where would a woman learn such things? Where would she see a devil to draw him? Where would she gain the knowledge to depict sin with such accuracy? And what else did she know that she hadn't put on the page? Inquisitors began to examine illustrations with fresh suspicion, not for their theology, but for their authorship. Were the hands that drew these beasts clean? Were they even male? They searched for signs, for lines that trembled too delicately, for brushwork that suggested femininity. And when they found it, or believed they had, punishment followed. Because a woman who could draw a devil might be consorting with him, and if she wasn't, then surely she wanted to. Otherwise, why all the curves? Why all the smiles? Why all the laughter in the margins? The devil did not belong at the edge of the page, and neither, they believed, did she. But the edge is where stories begin, where structure gives way to intuition, where mischief and memory take root. And in the centuries that followed, the marginalia survived. Not in every book, not in every church, but enough. Enough to tell us that someone, somewhere, was laughing, was drawing, was resisting, was naming the devil, and surviving the page, if not the fire. There are rooms in history we forget to knock on. Rooms without kings or cathedrals. Rooms with no battles, no banners, no noise. Just long tables, shuttered windows, and the soft scratch, scratch, scratch of quills. This is where women went to disappear, and sometimes to reappear in ink. We imagine medieval nunneries as places of retreat, wombs of piety, white-walled sanctuaries where silence folded over everything like a burial shroud. But they were also places of work, of rigor, of astonishing intellectual activity, and in their most secret alcoves, beneath eaves blackened by candle smoke, were scriptoria. Rooms where women weren't just permitted to think, they were expected to. Let us enter one, slowly, softly. Let the oak door close behind you with a thud like a hymn's final note. The air is cold here, not from neglect but from discipline. There is no fire. Ink warps in heat. Each scribe sits before a slanted desk, angled to catch what little winter light seeps in. Their tools are simple. Their task is not. They copy books, line by line, breath by breath, not for glory, not for pay, for salvation. For each word copied correctly is a prayer, and each prayer may tip the scale, may preserve a soul, may pull the world one finger's breadth closer to God. But among the pious recitations, among the Amen and the Et in Secula Seculorum, some women learned more than orthodoxy. They learned to see, not just to read, to see color, symbol, composition, gesture, silence. And this sight, quietly cultivated in shadowed halls, was dangerous. Women weren't forbidden from art. Not exactly. They were, at times, celebrated for it, especially in monastic communities where men were scarce and books still needed to be made. Across the 12th and 13th centuries, convents in Germany, France, and Flanders trained women in the sacred labor of illumination. These weren't simple decorators. They were theologians in pigment. They knew how to stretch vellum without tearing, how to grind lapis lazuli into a blue so divine it seemed to hum. They knew which brushes would fray after a single session, and which could last for months if trimmed with care and humility. They knew that gold leaf didn't stick unless you breathed evenly. Too shallow, it flaked. Too sharp, it tore. Every breath, like every letter, had to be intentional. They worked not with paint, but with memory. Many of them weren't permitted direct access to models or examples. They had to recreate Christ from a glimpse, a virgin from a verbal description, a devil from a sermon's shudder. And in doing so, they were not just copying, they were composing, inventing, interpreting, and eventually transgressing. Because to depict is to define, and to define is to assert knowledge. And knowledge, in the wrong hands, was sin. You see, a woman painting Mary might accidentally give her her own nose, her fingers, her own mouth, and suddenly the Mother of God looks just a little too human, just a little too present. She looks like the girl who washes linens, or the sister who sings too softly, or the novice who once said no and wasn't forgiven. A woman illuminating the apocalypse might slip a real monster into Revelation, not a dragon, but an abbot, not Babylon, but a convent kitchen. Satire slipped in beneath Scripture, ink as indictment, color as confession, gold leaf as holy defiance. And yet, for a while, it was tolerated, even admired. The Abbess Hildegard von Bingen, visionary, composer, polymath, was allowed to illuminate her own prophecies. She saw cosmic wheels and divine tongues and towers of fire. She painted them with authority, and because she called them visions, not dreams, not opinions, she was believed. Sort of. Others were less fortunate. The further a woman strayed from replication, the closer she drew to suspicion. An embellishment was a question. A question was a doubt. And a doubting woman was just a witch in rehearsal. So they learned to be careful, to flourish in silence, to layer meaning like pigment, thinly, expertly, over time. They learned that red was not just blood, but birth. That gold was not just glory, but power. That blue, the rarest blue, was not just heaven, but permission. You see, not all colors were equal, not in cost, not in symbolism, and not in access. Ultramarine, the luminous blue made from lapis lazuli mined in Afghanistan, was more expensive than gold, reserved for the robes of the Virgin, for the sky above Christ, and almost never for women's hands. Some convents were forbidden from purchasing it outright. Others were allowed to use it only under male supervision, because too much beauty in the wrong hands could distract, could tempt, could speak too loudly. So women found their own blues, from berries, from stones, from mixtures that faded quickly, but still whispered, still shimmered, still said, I was here, I saw this, I knew how to make heaven with my hands. There is a fragment, a single leaf, held now in a Berlin museum. No one knows its creator. But the vellum is smooth, the calligraphy precise, and in the lower margin curls a miniature scene, a nun kneeling before a mirror. But in the reflection, not her own face, but a demon's, not grotesque, not monstrous, just smiling, just watching, just her if she had told the truth. Scholars argue, was it self-deprecation, a warning, a parody of vanity, or something more intimate, a confession without words? We will never know, because her name is gone, scraped off, bleached out, faded by centuries of forgetfulness. But her ink remains, her line work, her vision, her mirror. What these women did was not simply artistic, it was theological. To place Christ on the page required understanding him. To illustrate sin required recognizing it. And to portray a demon accurately, expressively, meant imagining one. Imagination, for women, was dangerous. It implied agency, autonomy, the ability to perceive not only what was taught, but what was felt, what was feared, what was suspected, what was real. And so they were watched, their palates monitored, their pigment use logged, their marginalia inspected not for technique, but for temptation. Because even a tiny flourish, a smile too wide, a halo too bright, a devil that looked too much like the prior, could be interpreted as intent. Still, they painted, they gilded, they wrote, they shaped silence into color, into story. And through that quiet labor, they carved out a space between obedience and authorship. They did not demand attention. They did not storm pulpits or pen manifestos. They simply kept drawing, kept seeing, kept leaving little pieces of themselves in the folds of robes, in the feathers of angels, in the curves of demons. In the next act, we'll descend further into the scenes that truly sparked fear, into the miniatures of heresy, where women no longer merely decorated faith, but questioned it, drew around it, subverted it, and in doing so, they became something more than artists. They became evidence. Some sins are loud, others are quiet, and then there are the ones painted in blue, shaped into halos, folded into the pleats of holy robes, so soft you might not even notice them. But someone always does. Eventually, especially if the hand that painted them belonged to a woman. Let's begin with a robe. A blue one, carefully brushed onto vellum. Its folds are delicate, outlined in gold. The Virgin Mary is seated, her face composed, her fingers curved in benediction. There is nothing obscene here, nothing deviant, only a woman and her God. But the blue is too vivid, the drapery too suggestive of hips, the fingers too slender, too real, the skin not alabaster, but kissed faintly with rose. And suddenly, the image no longer invites worship, it invites attention. And that, in the eyes of the Church, is perilously close to desire. In medieval art, the body was never neutral, especially not the female body, especially not when it was painted by another woman. Throughout the 12th to 15th centuries, artists were not just creators, they were theologians. Every choice, pose, pigment, proportion carried doctrinal weight. A breast visible in nativity scenes symbolized nourishment. A tilt of the head implied humility. A naked Christ child, vulnerable on a bed of hay, was a visual sermon on incarnation. But as image blurred into realism, as saints became less symbolic and more human, the line between veneration and seduction grew perilously thin, especially for the Virgin, especially in the hands of a woman. To paint the Virgin Mary was a devotional act, but to make her too beautiful, too corporeal, was to invite suspicion. Her face was to be serene, yes, but not too expressive. Her body was to be maternal, but not sensual. She was to be adored, but never desired. Male painters could occasionally transgress these boundaries. They had names, patrons, protections. But women? Women were already walking the tightrope. And even a single brush stroke, a slightly parted lip, a robe draped just too naturally, could tip them into heresy. There are records, quiet, accusatory, of women being questioned for artistic choices. One illuminator, a nun in Poitiers, painted the Virgin with downcast eyes and flushed cheeks. It was called too intimate, too emotional. She was asked if she had modeled the face on someone she knew. When she said nothing, they demanded to know whether it was herself. And when she still said nothing, they forbade her from illustrating again. The suspicion was never about just one painting. It was about the idea that a woman could see the divine differently, could see Mary not only as mother or intercessor, but as a woman, a body, a vessel of power and pain, and that she might paint what she saw not out of error, but intention. And what happens when a woman paints not the Virgin, but herself into sainthood? When her brush refuses to flatter, refuses to conform, refuses to remain quiet, she becomes visible. And visibility in sacred spaces is rarely safe. There was another concern, more whispered than written, that women artists understood the body too well, that in painting Mary nursing the infant Christ, they might recall how it feels to nurse, that in painting the folds of a robe, they might know how it moves when knelt in, that in painting suffering, they might not be imagining, and that their intimacy with the subject, their embodied knowledge, made the painting too honest, too alive, too close to truth. So the Church invented a defense, control through iconographic rules, through color restrictions, compositional templates, and a slow, steady erasure of female attribution. Because if the artist was nameless, then the artwork couldn't ask questions. Let's speak of iconography, a visual code, sanctioned, guarded, enforced. Saints were to be depicted with their attributes. Peter with keys, Catherine with a wheel, Agnes with a lamb. Deviate from these, and the saint might become unrecognizable, unstable, subversive. In one illuminated book of hours, a female scribe added a scene of Saint Barbara, not with her usual tower, but kneeling at the sea, holding a rope. No one knows why. Some think it references a local miracle. Others suspect personal grief. But what mattered to the censors was that it was unapproved, unstandardized. It made Saint Barbara too particular, too personal. And a personal saint is dangerously close to a pagan deity, a divine woman drawn from flesh instead of scripture. There are subtler crimes too. A hand too expressive. A saint looking out from the page rather than demurely inward. Paintings where Christ's wounds look like childbirth scars. Manuscripts where the devil smiles a little too knowingly, not as temptation, but as memory, as if he's not being imagined, but remembered. And who, the inquisitors asked, would remember such a face? The paradox is sharp. Women were permitted to paint the divine, but not to interpret it. They could labor for hours on the gold trim of a halo, but if they dared to suggest that holiness might feel like exhaustion, or beauty might come with blood, they were suspect. And so their work was policed. By confessors, by abbots, by silence. But some resisted, not in rebellion, but in detail. They painted folds that curved like bodies, eyes that looked back, halos that flickered at the edges, women who wept, not gracefully, not symbolically, but with red-rimmed eyes and swollen cheeks. And somehow those tears said more than any sermon. Let us return to pigment, because even color could be scandalous. We've spoken of ultramarine, heaven's blue, but let us speak now of red. Red was a problem. It could be blood. It could be lust. It could be fire. It could be the lips of a saint, or the mouth of a devil. It was the color of martyrdom and menstruation. And when applied too generously, too vividly, it was a question no one wanted to answer. One manuscript, now housed in Florence, contains an image of Mary Magdalene. Her robe is red, her hair gold, loose, defiant. She stands barefoot, unashamed, and next to her is a line of text, carefully illuminated. She saw and was not afraid. Scholars argue over whether the phrase refers to Magdalene or to the woman who painted her, because it's unsigned. Of course it is. But the style, the brushwork, suggest a feminine hand, a hand that saw and was not afraid. Of course, not every woman painted in defiance. Many followed the rules. Many loved them. But even within obedience, there is agency. And it is worth remembering that sometimes just following a line, just painting a saint's foot with care, or draping a robe with truth was enough to raise suspicion. Because when beauty came from the hands of women, the question was always, who taught them this? And what else might they know? There are colors in history that were never meant to be touched. Colors too sacred, too expensive, too alive. Colors that shimmered on the robes of saints and in the eyes of dragons, but only when painted by the right hands. And when a woman reached for them, they were called dangerous, unclean, unfit, because color, like Scripture, was a form of control. Let's begin with blue. Not just any blue, but ultramarine, a color pulled from the belly of the earth, ground from lapis lazuli, mined in the far reaches of Afghanistan. Its name means beyond the sea. Its price was higher than gold, and its use was rationed with reverence, suspicion, and greed. Ultramarine was reserved for the most sacred parts of an image: the Virgin's robe, the sky behind Christ, the wings of Gabriel. To paint with it was to claim authority. To paint with it was to whisper to the viewer, "This is where heaven touches earth." And so, in most scriptoria, it was locked away, literally, in small wooden boxes sealed with iron, accessible only to the master scribe, and very rarely, if ever, to women. Color was not a gift. It was a hierarchy, and women stood near the bottom. They were permitted black, brown, ochre, modest red, colors of humility, of flesh, of dust. They could paint the borders, the frames. The minor saints no one prayed to anymore. But if they reached for the expensive pigments, If they dared dip their brush into divine blue or imperial purple, they were watched. And if they used too much, they were reprimanded. And if they asked why, they were punished. Because color in the medieval world wasn't just decoration, it was theology. And theology wasn't a woman's to wield. Let's open a pigment box. You will not find just powders. You will find blood, poison, prayer, and history crushed into dust. Cinnabar, for red, a mercury sulfide so toxic it blackened the fingernails of those who ground it. Verdigris, for green, harvested from copper left to rot in vinegar, its fumes sharp enough to blind. Orpiment, for gold, arsenic-rich and luminous, used sparingly, handled with dread. And cochineal, for the most delicate of reds, not mineral, but insect. Thousands of crushed beetles, their bodies turned to scarlet, imported from the Americas after 1500, but before that, imagined only in dreams. Each pigment had a price, in coin, in labor, in access, and women, unless they were of noble birth or cloistered with favor, were rarely given the keys. At the Abbey of St. Walburga in Bavaria, the pigment records still survive. Line after line of careful Latin, listing how many ounces of gold leaf were allotted per month, how many pinches of lapis, how much saffron could be spared. And in the margins of those records, sometimes, you'll find initials, tiny, almost apologetic, women's names. Beside them, notations, too much, excessive, unnecessary. Not for mistakes, not for waste, but for boldness, for audacity, for asking. One sister, Juliana of Augsburg, was reprimanded for painting 3 full folios with azurite. She had followed the template, copied the correct saints, used no gold. And still, she was corrected, because the blue was too rich, too noticeable, too much like something a man would paint. There was an unspoken rule that women's art should fade, that it should whisper, not sing, that it should be devotional in spirit and muted in form. Color, uncontrolled, was a threat. It might evoke desire. It might stir memory. It might, God forbid, make the viewer feel something new. A male artist could be praised for realism, for flesh that glowed, for robes that shimmered, for devils that leapt from the page with gleaming red eyes. But a woman, she was meant to copy, to submit, to repeat what had already been sanctified by male hands. If she colored outside the lines, the question was never about her technique. It was about her intent. And intent in a woman was always suspect. Consider this. Even the binders of pigments, the liquids that turned powder to paint, were gendered. Egg tempera, made with yolk and water, was considered modest. Gum arabic, the sap of the acacia, was thought appropriate. But oil, rich, heavy, seductive, was frowned upon, not because it was ineffective, but because it made colors bloom too brightly, too sensually, too much like life. In some convents, oil was banned entirely. In others, it was kept under lock. And if a woman's brushwork shimmered with too much luster, she was questioned, not for her skill, but for what she was trying to say. Because color speaks. It always has. And in the wrong hands, it could say things no words dared whisper. A virgin's robe too vivid might suggest longing. A devil painted in purple might mock the robes of cardinals. A saint with green-shadowed eyes might resemble the abbess too closely. And suddenly, the page is not a prayer, but a mirror. And no one likes to see themselves reflected in the margins. So colors were rationed to preserve sanctity, they said, but truly to preserve control, to keep mystery where it belonged, in the hands of men. But not all women obeyed. Some found pigments in secret, ground their own minerals, traded herbs and stones with apothecaries, bartered for beetles, scraped paint from broken frescoes, mixed ink with wine, with tears, with menstrual blood, and when they painted, their colors didn't follow the rules. They bled, they burned, they lasted. There is a psalter in northern Spain, now nameless and fragmented. Its illuminations are strange. Christ is painted with copper skin. Mary's robe shifts from green to violet, depending on the light. Angels bear instruments not found in Scripture. And the devils, they are bright. Not red, not black, but electric blue, the same shade forbidden to most women, the same shade locked in iron boxes. And beside one of these images, there is a name, written not in gold, but in rust-colored ink. Lucia fecit hoc. Lucia made this. No one knows who she was, but she signed it. And that, in a world of erasure, is a rebellion made of color. So we must ask, why was color so feared? Because it was beauty? Because it was life? Because it reminded the viewer that the sacred could be seen, could be desired, could be touched? Or was it because the church feared what women might reveal, if allowed to paint truthfully? That heaven might look different, that saints might weep like mothers, that devils might smile like priests, that God, if painted by a woman, might actually look back. In our next scene, we return to the page. Not the pigment this time, but the books themselves, the psalters that misbehaved, the gospels that smuggled secrets in their margins, the manuscripts that carried too much color, too much humanity, too much of their creators. And for that, they were silenced, or burned, or, if we're lucky, only forgotten. There are books that behave, and then there are books that remember. Not with words, those can be crossed out. Not with names, those can be scraped clean. But with margins, with pigments that refuse to fade, with saints who look back, with devils who linger, with lines drawn by hands the church tried to forget. This is the story of those books, the psalters and hours that didn't know their place, or rather, refused it. Books too vivid, too personal, too strange. Books that drew too close to heresy, and sometimes too close to the truth. Books that were almost always, quietly, inconveniently, touched by women. Let us begin with a psalter. France, late 13th century. Small enough to be carried, rich enough to be guarded. Its script is perfect, black ink, rigid spacing, but its illuminations are off. The angels have bare feet. Mary's robe is painted with tiny flowers, wild and local, violets, meadowsweet, yarrow. The saints wear expressions of doubt, and in the margins there are rabbits. So many rabbits. But they're not playing. They're watching. One holds a knife. Another wears a bishop's mitre. One rests its paw on a skull. Scholars debate. Were they satire? Symbol? A private joke? Or something else? Some insist it was the work of a female scribe, trained in a nearby convent known for peculiar styles. There is no signature, but in the final folio, pressed between paint and parchment, is a long, pale hair, red blonde, still curled from the centuries, still waiting to be noticed. These books survive in fragments. They live in glass cases now, in Basel, Bruges, Krakow, London. Their names are impersonal. Miss 182, Codex 48, the Thornton Hours. Their creators are nameless, but their fingerprints remain. You can see them in the corners, where the rules bend slightly, where a saint's halo is just a little crooked, where the Virgin's eyes look tired, where a demon appears beneath a tree, not burning, not screaming, just sitting, thinking. They were drawn by someone who had been thinking, too, and that's what frightened people most. One of the most infamous cases of a psalter misbehaving comes from Flanders. A manuscript discovered in the 1400s, buried beneath floorboards in a collapsing convent. It was perfectly preserved, but its contents were anything but perfect. The prayers were intact. The saints, correctly labeled, but the imagery, off, just off. The Annunciation scene features Gabriel with wings that look like raven feathers. Mary does not smile. Instead, she shields her stomach. Not in awe, but in apprehension. Elsewhere, the devil appears, frequently and oddly. He is not cast out. He is not rebuked. He simply stands in the background, hands folded, watching the holy unfold, uninvited, but never banished. The final image is the most unsettling. It shows a woman, unnamed, haloed, but not a known saint. She stands alone in a garden. Behind her, a shadow looms. But instead of fleeing, she turns to face it and smiles, as if to say, "I drew you. I know you. I am not afraid." The manuscript was never officially condemned, but it was hidden. Its origin remains unconfirmed, but the brushwork suggests a woman's hand. Precise, controlled, unorthodox, like someone who knew the rules and chose, carefully, when to break them. We must understand, books were not neutral. They were relics, weapons, proof. A woman accused of witchcraft might be searched not for herbs, but for books. And if a psalter was found with too much red, too many beasts, too many female saints painted with knowing eyes, that was enough. It didn't have to be a grimoire. It just had to be strange, personal, touched, marked by someone who saw holiness and danger as neighbors, not opposites. At the Dominican convent of Unterlinden, a nun named Margaretha was accused in 1462 of drawing too freely. That was the phrase used, too freely, not incorrectly, not sacrilegiously, just freely. Her illustrations included scenes not found in Scripture: women bathing in moonlight, a saint comforting a demon, a small child feeding a serpent with milk. When questioned, she claimed they were dreams, divine dreams, visions. But the inquisitor didn't care for that answer. He asked if she had learned to draw from Scripture. She said, "Number from memory," and that, more than anything, sealed her fate. Her book was seized, disassembled, its pages dispersed across Europe. 3 have been recovered, the rest gone or waiting. Some books were altered, not burned, not buried, but corrected. Gold painted over with whitewash, margins trimmed, faces blurred, breasts erased, wings redrawn, devils replaced with lions, lions replaced with silence. But sometimes you can still see what came before: ultramarine ghosts beneath chalk, scratched lines that form words no one was meant to read, a faint outline of a hand resting on the page, as if the artist paused too long, or pressed too hard, or didn't want to let go. Why does this matter? Because books were not simply containers of knowledge. They were extensions of the hand, the mind, the soul. And when a woman made one, she left more than paint. She left herself, her prayers, her questions, her devils, not in the text that could be rewritten, but in the margins. That's where she lived. That's where she still does. We often speak of medieval women as voiceless, but they were not silent. They wrote, they painted, they stitched, they composed, they drew, not loudly, but clearly, and the fact that we must look so closely to see them, that we must peer into corners, beneath paint, behind saints, does not make them invisible. It makes them enduring. The psalters that didn't know their place have lasted longer than the men who tried to erase them. They were too beautiful, too strange, too insistent. They refused to disappear. In the next act, we cross a darker threshold, from the illuminated to the accused, from books that whispered to mouths that confessed. We'll step into the inquisitor's chamber, where women's drawings became evidence, where ink turned to sin and parchment to proof. Because when a woman painted too clearly, too vividly, too freely, the question wasn't whether she was a witch, but whether she had already drawn the devil's face. It begins with a drawing, not in a book, not in a margin, but on a single loose sheet of parchment, unbound, untitled, unclean. It shows a woman, naked, faceless, surrounded by fire. Around her are shapes, symbols, tiny, curling letters in a language no one remembers teaching her. She says it's just a dream. They say it's a confession. They pin it to the wall beside her cell, and then they wait. This is not a scene from myth. It is from the records of the inquisitors of Carcassonne, dated 1321. A woman, arrested on suspicion of heresy, was found with drawings, rough sketches, one of a devil with 3 mouths, one of a hand holding a serpent, one of herself, naked, burning, smiling. When asked why she drew them, she replied, "They told me to." She didn't say who they were. She didn't need to. The drawings said enough. By the 14th century, Europe had perfected the art of punishment. Torture had become codified, bureaucratic, sanctified, and with it came a peculiar obsession, not just with what a person said, but with what they saw. Vision mattered. So did memory. And for women accused of witchcraft or heresy, what they had seen often carried more weight than anything they'd done. But memories fade, words shift, and so the inquisitors asked, again and again, for drawings. Show us what you saw. Show us the ritual. Draw the devil. And they did, with trembling hands, with borrowed ink, on scraps of paper already yellowing, not to summon evil, but to survive it, or at least to delay it. We have fragments, tucked into trial records, doodles mistaken for diagrams, charcoal sketches collected like relics. Many were destroyed. Some survive, and they tell a story far more haunting than any spellbook. One woman, brought before the Inquisition in Toulouse, drew a tree. Its branches curled unnaturally, some blooming, some rotting. At the base sat a beast, part goat, part woman, her hands clasped in prayer. When asked what it meant, the woman wept. She said it came to her in sleep. The inquisitor wrote only, "Subject confesses to demonic vision, confirms pact." There was no pact. There was no devil. Only a dream and a drawing. Art in this world was not interpretation. It was evidence. Ink was no longer sacred. It was forensic. To draw a demon was to prove you knew one. To sketch a ritual was to confess you'd performed it. And if the drawing resembled anyone the inquisitors recognized, a bishop, a neighbor, a husband, then you weren't just a heretic. You were a liar, a threat, a mirror no one wanted held up. Because drawings don't stammer. They don't recant. They don't forget. And when signed, even with a thumbprint or a scratched initial, they linger. But not all drawings were confessions. Some were testimonies, not of guilt, but of pain. A woman in Lucerne, accused of poisoning a priest, was given parchment to explain herself. Instead of words, she drew a figure bound to a post, blindfolded, mouth open in song. She said it was herself. Said she used to sing in the church choir before they silenced her. Said she wasn't guilty. That the poison had been meant for her. The inquisitor dismissed the image as incoherent. But another woman, brought in months later, recognized the drawing. Said she'd seen that same scene in a dream. Said she too had once sung. And so the drawing was copied, reproduced, shared. Suddenly it was no longer memory. It was doctrine. A quiet heresy carried not in word, but in image. There is an unspoken truth here, one that lingers at the edge of every folio, every courtroom, every execution square, that sometimes what they called sorcery was simply memory made visible. Women drew their pain because no one else would, because to speak it was to risk being called mad, because to weep was to confirm possession. But to draw was quieter, slower, and sometimes it passed unnoticed. Sometimes, but not always. And when it didn't, the consequences were swift. The scribbled image of a hand holding a candle, the crescent moon drawn beside a name, a pentagram in a corner, a bird with a human eye. All of these have appeared in inquisitorial records, described, sketched, preserved, rarely understood. They were called sigils, spells, diagrams of intention. But what if they were none of those? What if they were just attempts to say, "This happened to me. I am here. I remember"? What if a spiral is just a spiral? What if a demon is just fear with a tail? What if the only sin was refusing to forget? In the town of Eichstätt, 1510, a woman named Anna was tried for witchcraft. The charge? She had drawn a map, not of the town, not of the forest, but of her dreams. She claimed she walked a path in sleep, always the same, always toward a dark figure who never spoke. She drew it for the tribunal, a narrow path lined with bones. At the end, a figure with no face. The inquisitor asked who it was. She said, "I think it's myself." She was burned 3 weeks later. The drawing was sent to Nuremberg. It is now lost. But the trial record survives. It ends with a line, "The accused had artistic skill beyond her station," as if that, too, was damning. So let us ask, when did drawing become a crime? Not for men, their anatomical studies, their illustrated bestiaries, their grotesques in the margins, those were permitted, celebrated, even. But a woman's image, especially of herself, that was vanity, rebellion, evidence. It is easier to burn a woman if she has already drawn her own flame. And still, they drew, some in protest, some in silence, some in hope that someone, someday, would see it differently. And we have, in the crumbling corners of trial records, in the footnotes of historians, in the pencil rubbings of archivists, we have found them, the women who dared to draw pain, and in doing so told stories no one wanted written. They drew hands, faces, symbols, themselves, and sometimes the devil, not because he was real, but because the accusation already was, because if they were going to be punished for seeing him, they might as well draw what they saw. In the next scene, we'll enter the dark gallery of inquisitorial manuals, illustrated texts filled with devils, rituals, and diagrams of sin. We'll ask who painted them, why their figures often resemble women, and what happens when the church commissions the very images it fears. Because some of the most enduring portraits of evil were made not by witches, but by priests. It was never enough to accuse a woman of witchcraft. They needed to show what it looked like. Not just tell you what she did, but illustrate it. A body writhing, a devil smiling, a ritual mid-movement candlelight flickering on naked limbs. Not imagined, depicted. In careful ink, on vellum or woodblock, pressed beneath the weight of ecclesiastical authority. Proof, drawn by the very hands that condemned her. The medieval inquisitor did not only rely on testimony, he needed a visual script, a sketchpad, a taxonomy of evil, complete with horns and sigils. Something he could hold in one hand while placing the other on a woman's shoulder, and saying, "Does this look familiar?" And so they made books, not holy ones, not quite, but sacred in a darker way, books that cataloged sin, illustrated it, made it legible. Books where the devil had a face, and that face, more often than not, looked like a woman. Let us begin with the most infamous, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. First printed in 1487, it was less a book than a weapon. Written by Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican inquisitor, it laid out not only why women were more susceptible to witchcraft, but how to detect them, how to test them, how to break them. It is a manual of suspicion, but also, quietly, grotesquely, a manual of imagination. Though the earliest editions did not include images, later printings were richly illustrated. Woodcuts of women flying through the air, suckling demons, gathering in moonlit fields, defiling crosses, copulating with beasts. Each picture told the same story. She was guilty. She was monstrous. She was familiar. But the drawings are not chaotic. They are elegant, balanced, measured in line and form. They are art. And that is what makes them dangerous. Because even cruelty, when drawn beautifully, becomes persuasive. The Compendium Maleficarum, printed in Milan in 1608, goes further. Compiled by Francesco Maria Guazzo, it is a collection of case studies, rituals, symbols, and, most memorably, images. Here, the devil wears many faces, but his most consistent feature is the company he keeps. Women, nude, kneeling, ecstatic, afraid. They dance around cauldrons. They cradle demons like children. They kiss beasts on the mouth. They offer hair, blood, teeth. Some cry. Some smile. None look away. The illustrations are woodcut, simple yet haunting. They were made to be copied, to travel, to stick in the mind of the priest, the judge, the reader by candlelight. They were pornography disguised as exorcism, art cloaked as instruction, and somewhere, someone held the blade that carved those images into wood, line by line, while imagining what a witch must look like. But who was that someone? In most cases, we do not know. The artists remain anonymous. Not unusual for the time, but still one wonders. Who sat at the bench, carving the devil's grin? Was it a monk, picturing sin with trembling reverence? Was it a hired artisan, indifferent to theology but skilled with knives? Or, though it seems unlikely, was it a woman? Because some of these images bear a strange intimacy, a detail too human, a glance too knowing, as if the illustrator wasn't imagining, but remembering. There is a woodcut in the Dictionnaire Infernal, published later, in 1818, but drawn from older sources, showing a female figure seated on a throne of bones. She is labeled Nehema, a consort of Satan, but her posture is contemplative. She holds a book. One foot is bare. The caption says, "She records the names of the damned." But you could just as easily read it another way, that she is not counting victims, but stories, that she is not cursing, but remembering. Inquisitors often read these books not just for guidance, but for confirmation. They wanted to see, in print, what they believed was already true, that witches gathered in secret, that they practiced obscene rites, that they bore marks, visible or otherwise, that set them apart. And the books obliged, with pictures, diagrams, maps of Sabbaths, charts of sin, anatomical illustrations of witches' teats, devils riding women like horses, women feeding animals from between their thighs. Women, always women, portrayed as portals to darkness, to desire, to knowledge unasked for. These images were not just representations. They were expectations, templates, visions so deeply etched into culture that real women in real trials began to echo them, to confess them, to draw them. Because what happens when you show someone enough pictures of a ritual? What happens when you press a book into her hands and say, "Did you do this?" And she says no. And you ask again, and again, and again, and again. Eventually, the answer becomes yes, or at least, "I think so," or worse, "I dreamed it." And that, too, becomes proof, because the image was there all along, waiting, like prophecy or a curse. Let us not forget, many of these books were published under ecclesiastical license, approved, endorsed, printed on the same presses that produced psalters and prayer books, stored on the same shelves, read by the same eyes. One bishop in Mainz is recorded as having bound his copy of the Compendium Maleficarum in red leather with silver clasps. He annotated the margins, underlined passages, circled the image of a woman levitating while clutching a child, wrote beside it, "Common behavior in Rhineland cases." The drawing does not show her face, but her arms are outstretched, not in attack, not in surrender, but in grief. And beneath her, a figure, smaller, cloaked, holding a blade. Some believe it is meant to represent the devil. Others say it looks more like a priest. So we return to the question we asked before. When did drawing become a crime? Perhaps when it stopped being devotional, when it stopped illustrating Scripture and started illustrating fear. But in these manuals, fear was sold as fact, imagination as testimony, art as accusation, and the line between truth and invention, so finely inked, was easy to cross, especially when someone else held the stylus. And the most terrifying thing? It worked. The images worked. They survived. They shaped law. They shaped memory. They shaped us. Today, we scroll past them. Woodcuts of witches and Sabbaths, engraved in cheap black lines. We chuckle. We repost. We see them as camp, as medieval kitsch. But we forget, they were never meant to be funny. They were meant to teach. And some of their students never left the classroom. In our next scene, we return to the women, to their drawings, their ink, their fragile hands. We examine how even their defenses became confessions. How a sketch of a familiar, a circle of chalk, a flower with too many petals, was enough to call it sorcery, even if it was just art, even if it was just grief. Because the line between testimony and betrayal is thinner than parchment, and when ink dries, it cannot take back what it was forced to say. The page doesn't tremble. The parchment does not plead. It does not contradict itself, forget a detail, or change its mind. It simply waits, quiet, flat, damning. And that is what made it so useful. Because when a woman was asked to draw what she'd done, what she'd dreamed, what she'd been told she was, the ink told a story that could not be taken back. This is where art ended, and evidence began. Inquisitorial courts in the 15th and 16th centuries relied on drawings as much as they did on speech. Not beautiful illuminations, not devils curled in margins, but crude lines hastily made, pressed into parchment with fingers that had not been trained, only broken. These weren't confessions. They were demands. Draw what you saw. Draw what you did. Draw what you are. And when the women drew, they were not believed, but they were condemned. Let us begin in Germany. In 1489, a woman named Marita of Ulm was arrested under suspicion of hexerei, sorcery. She was a midwife, a widow, a painter's daughter. She had grown up around pigment, knew how to stretch vellum, how to grind saffron with vinegar. When asked to draw a ritual she was accused of performing, she complied. She sketched a circle, 4 candles, a cradle in the center, an infant. The inquisitors read it as evidence of child sacrifice. Marita said it was the baptism of her own daughter, who had died before the priest came. Before the words were said, she had buried the body herself and drawn the scene because she remembered it too clearly to say aloud. She was executed that spring. The drawing is lost, but the record of it remains. It is referred to as diagramma malefica, a diagram of malice, a mother's grief rebranded as doctrine. Ink had rules. It had codes. Certain shapes were already loaded with meaning. A 5-pointed star, satanic. A circle with a name in it, invocation. A flower with 13 petals, an omen. Even if the woman insisted it was just a flower, even if it looked nothing like one, even if it wasn't a flower at all. Because intent was irrelevant. She drew it, and therefore she must have known what it meant. Even when she didn't, especially when she didn't escape. Some drawings were prompted under torture, others before it. Inquisitors learned quickly that a woman might refuse to speak, but give her ink and a moment of silence, and she might betray herself without knowing it. In Toulouse, a woman named Agnes was asked to illustrate the demon she consorted with. She insisted she had never seen a demon. They gave her a quill anyway, told her to close her eyes and draw. What emerged was a bird, winged, humanoid, with claws for feet and a face like her own. She wept when she saw it, said it had come to her in dreams since childhood, said it protected her. The inquisitors called it a familiar, proof of guilt. They copied the drawing, reproduced it in trial records, margins, training manuals. One copy survives in a Jesuit collection in Krakow. It is labeled Demonium Agnesi, the demon of Agnes. There are others, hundreds. Most are gone, decayed or burned or left to dust. But their descriptions remain in footnotes, in annexes, in corners of parchment where judges summarize the evidence. Sometimes scrawled in Latin, see drawing on verso. Sometimes more directly, she revealed herself in ink. It is a terrible phrase. Revealed herself. As though truth leaks from fingertips. As though drawing were not defense, but diagnosis. We must pause here. Not for sentiment, but for clarity. Most of these women were not trained artists. Their lines were rough, imprecise. And still, those lines held power. Power not because they summoned anything, but because they suggested. A woman accused of cursing livestock draws a goat. The goat has too many teeth. A woman suspected of seduction draws a necklace she once wore. It is mistaken for a sigil. Another sketches a child she lost. The child is smiling unnaturally, and that smile is called evidence. What the inquisitors feared most wasn't witchcraft. It was interpretation, the possibility that a woman might have a visual language they did not understand, that she might be saying something they could not hear, but others might. We must also ask, how many of these drawings were forged? Copied? Embellished after the fact? The records do not say, but we know that art, like testimony, could be shaped, adjusted, reframed. Ink could be added, margins trimmed, symbols corrected by someone else's hand. And once altered, who could say what had come from the woman, and what had come from the accusation itself? Inquisitors were not only judges, they were editors, redacting, annotating, illustrating women into guilt. Still, not all drawings were coerced. Some were made before the arrest, in secret, in devotion, or in mourning. And when they were found, hidden in prayer books, stitched into bodices, pressed between pages, they became ammunition. One woman, Isolde of Baden, was found with a miniature painted on vellum the size of a coin. It depicted a hand holding a flame. She said it was Saint Apollonia. Her interrogator said it was Lucifer. She insisted it was a symbol of endurance. He said it was a spell. He drew a line beneath her own, added symbols of his own, then called it collaboration. Isolde was not permitted to speak at her trial, but her drawing was held aloft. And that was enough. It is hard to speak of these things without bitterness. Hard to describe the quiet terror of being asked to illustrate your own undoing, of watching someone else interpret your lines, your symbols, your face, and call it a portrait of evil. Because what these women left behind were not just sketches. They were mirrors, and mirrors, in the wrong light, become windows. And once you've looked in, once you've seen what someone has drawn, what they've dreamed, what they've feared, you cannot unsee it. Even if they beg you to, even if they didn't want you to, even if it was never meant for you at all. In the closing scene of this act, we'll return to the question behind all of this. What made these women dangerous? Was it that they knew too much? Or that they imagined too clearly? That their drawings were not spells, but survival? And that in tracing their own truth, they told stories no one wanted remembered? Because in every ink-stained testimony, there is not just confession, but creation. And creation, in the wrong hands, has always been the devil's favorite disguise. Her name was Marjorie Greaves. She was 54 years old when the neighbors stopped calling her by name and started calling her witch. It began with milk turning sour. Then came the shriveled apples, a child's fever, a man's impotence, each one small, forgettable, explainable. But together they formed a shape, a pattern, a picture, and all it needed was a face. They chose hers. She lived alone in a stone cottage on the edge of a village whose name has not survived. She kept bees. She sketched birds. She painted little flowers in the corners of her psalter, not out of heresy, but habit. She was never seen dancing in the woods, never found with dolls or bones. But she had ink, and she used it. In the spring of 1578, Marjorie was arrested. She was given no warning, no opportunity to hide her books, her sketches, her words. They took everything, not because it was dangerous, but because it could be read, and in that reading, reshaped. The trial records survive miraculously in the County Archive of Lincolnshire. 6 folios, written in careful, detached Latin, but tucked between 2 of the pages, folded tightly, was a drawing, not made by the clerk, not by the court, but by Marjorie herself. It is small, drawn in brown ink, delicate and deliberate. A figure, seated, bound, blindfolded, not weeping, not begging, just waiting. Beside her, a shape, a bird, maybe, a shadow, or a flame. It isn't labeled. Nothing is. But at the bottom of the page is one word, in faint script, witness. No one knows when she made it. Before the trial? During it? Was it drawn in her cell in the moments between questioning and sleep? Did she show it to them? Or hide it? The judges never mention it in the official record. They focus on testimony, on character, on her peculiar fondness for drawing birds. One witness claimed she had once gifted a child a painted feather. The child had fallen ill weeks later. The correlation was declared a curse. Another testified that Marjorie's psalter had images in it, strange shapes, unnatural blossoms, eyes without heads. She had, in fact, drawn nothing but violets and larks. But by the time the book reached the bench, its pages were missing, or stained, or replaced. The drawings that survived did not help her. They were described in court as artes suspectae, suspicious arts. One was said to feature a snake wrapped around a tree. Another, a hand reaching through a door. She had painted both years earlier, as metaphors, as memories. But they were not read as metaphor, and memory, in this place, had no standing. Marjorie was asked repeatedly, "Why do you draw?" She gave many answers. To pass the time, to decorate my prayers, because it helps me remember, because it is quiet. But one answer, more than the others, appears in the record. She said, "Because no one listens when I speak." The scribe recorded it neutrally. The judge did not comment. But later, in the margin beside the quote, another hand has written, "Dangerous woman," and underlined it. There is no evidence that Marjorie was tortured. But the silence around her trial speaks loudly. The pages grow sparse. The entries shorter. A decision is reached in less than 3 days. She is found guilty of maleficium. Her punishment is death by fire. The final note in the record reads, execution to be carried out swiftly, personal effects to be burned. But something was missed. Something tucked into her psalter, or slipped into the fold of her gown, or left behind in the cell when they took her. That drawing, the one labeled witness, it was not burned. It is an unassuming piece. The paper is thin, cheap, stiff from age, but the line work is elegant, intentional. There is weight to it. The figure, bound and blindfolded, does not appear afraid. Her shoulders are set. Her hands are loose. She is not weeping. She is seeing, just not with her eyes. And that, perhaps, is the point. That even with her eyes covered, she knows what is happening. She is witnessing something the world refuses to name. Or perhaps, she is the witness. To herself, to her silence, to her fire. There are whispers that Marjorie's case was not unique, that other women, accused, condemned, forgotten, left drawings behind, scratched into stone, carved into wood, pressed into wax, into cloth, into earth. Traces, echoes, tiny screams disguised as pictures. One archivist in Somerset cataloged several such fragments in the 1890s. Crude faces, circles, hands, no names, no explanations, just lines. But sometimes, lines are enough. Marjorie's drawing now lives in a museum drawer, not on display, labeled simply Anonymous English 16th C, possibly related to witchcraft. No mention of her name, no mention of her trial, no mention of what she tried to say. But we remember, because the paper survived, because the ink clung to the fibers, because somewhere, someone chose not to burn it, or forgot, or couldn't. And so her hand, centuries later, still reaches out, still draws, still waits to be seen. What do we do with a woman like Marjorie, who did not curse, did not conjure, did not fly or dance or summon, but who drew, and in doing so, became dangerous? Was it her pictures they feared, or the silence behind them? The possibility that she knew something and chose not to say it aloud? That she was watching, witnessing, even as she was bound. We speak often of fire, but it wasn't the flame that destroyed women like Marjorie. It was the way the world read them, the stories told in their place, the ink they left behind, so easily twisted into prophecy, into confession, into ash. In the next scene, we'll enter the theology of fear itself, the rituals of exorcists and monks who were allowed to draw demons, who were encouraged to illustrate evil as long as they did so from the right side of the altar. We'll ask why men could paint hell and be praised, while women painted silence and were damned. Because the question was never whether demons could be pictured. It was always, who is holding the brush? He has claws, or hooves, or wings folded like a bat's, glossy like a beetle's. His teeth are often too many, his tongue forked or swollen or aflame. Sometimes he's red, sometimes black, sometimes the pale green of something that's rotted in secret. This is the devil, not the real one, perhaps, but the drawn one, the one made in ink and chalk and blood and prayer, the one summoned not by witches, but by priests, carefully, obediently, in the margins of manuscripts, in exorcism manuals, in sacred art commissioned by popes, because while women were burned for sketching demons, men were paid for it. Let us begin with a paradox. In medieval Europe, it was both heresy to imagine the devil and necessary to do so. How could you protect a soul from evil if you couldn't describe it? How could you cast out a demon if you didn't know its face? And so the church, reluctantly, cautiously, allowed its clerics to draw, to render hell, to paint temptation, to record in images what the faithful must fear. But only certain hands could do this. Hands trained in theology, hands sealed by ordination, hands that trembled only with devotion, never with imagination. In short, not women's hands. We begin with the Liber Floridus, a 12th century encyclopedic manuscript. Within its gilded pages sits a small, horned creature, labeled Diabolus. He crouches near the text, his tail twining around a column of script. His eyes are wide, almost surprised. He is not terrifying, but he is detailed, studied. The scribe, Lambert of Saint-Omer, was praised for the image. It showed, his abbot said, that Lambert understood the contours of evil, that he had studied darkness deeply enough to illustrate it. And so the devil, when drawn by Lambert, was not dangerous. He was instructive. We move now to exorcists, men tasked not only with casting out demons, but describing them, sometimes in writing, sometimes in paint, always with reverence. The Rituale Romanum, codified in 1614, includes instructions for identifying and resisting demons. While the text is dominant, early manuscript copies often included sketches, faces with elongated jaws, twisted hands, serpents erupting from mouths. These were not artistic flourishes, they were field guides, visual aids, tools. Monks copied them carefully, each line an act of spiritual warfare. To draw a demon was to prepare for battle, to catalog its features, its favorite lies, its smell was to stand guard. And if the sketches were grotesque, obsessive, even intimate, no one questioned it. They were men. They were defending the soul. They were allowed to see and to show. One of the most elaborate of these holy horrors comes from the 15th century manuscript known as the CLM 276, a German collection of exorcism texts and visions. Within it are illustrations of over 30 demons. Some resemble animals, others malformed humans. One is simply a mouth, ringed with flames. Another wears a bishop's mitre. The images are disturbing, but precise. Each demon is labeled, each assigned a sin, a vice, a preferred method of corruption. They are drawn not to arouse fear, but to organize it, to frame the unknowable, to make chaos manageable. It is theology in graphite, canon by candlelight. And then there is Hildegard, abbess, mystic, composer. She saw visions, many. And unlike most women, she was believed, or at least tolerated. In her Civias, a sprawling, illustrated account of divine revelation, we see devils unlike any others. They are abstract, burning, less like creatures, more like illness, sin rendered as heat, as color, as shrieking shape. Hildegard's drawings, created with the help of scribes, were sanctioned because she was a seer, because she never claimed authorship, because she couched her images in scripture, because she was careful. But even then, even cloaked in God, she was watched. Later editors redrew some of her devils, simplified them, made them more legible, less strange. Because even when women were allowed to draw, they were not allowed to define. And so we return to the paradox. Men could illustrate hell as long as they didn't enjoy it. Women, if they illustrated anything not immediately holy, were assumed to be in its service. A monk paints a demon's swollen belly. He is a scholar. A nun paints a serpent in a garden. She is a heretic. A priest sketches lust as a woman dancing. He is moralizing. A woman sketches herself dancing. She is burned. The same lines, different verdicts, because the fear was never about the image. It was about who imagined it. And why? Let us pause on one final example, the Ars Moriendi, the art of dying well. A 15th century guidebook for the dying, filled with illustrations of the soul in its final struggle. Demons surround the deathbed, temptations whisper into ears, angels wait behind the curtains. The illustrations are small, blocky, tender. They offer not comfort, but clarity. This is what evil looks like. This is what you must resist. The artists were anonymous, likely monks. Some may have copied from earlier versions. Some may have added devils of their own. One margin includes a demon holding a mirror to the dying man's face. The face in the mirror is twisted, unfamiliar, and possibly female. Interpretation is debated, but perhaps it doesn't matter. The mirror, after all, is the real image, and what terrifies us most is what we already carry inside. The church knew this, feared this, which is why the devil had to be illustrated, again and again, to keep him visible, defined, controlled, contained. And it worked. Sort of. He was printed, copied, distributed, made real through repetition, through ink, through line and shape, through centuries of sketches, all approved, all male. But the more the church drew him, the more familiar he became, and eventually, his face began to look suspiciously like their own. And what of the women? They saw devils too, in dreams, in pain, in the faces of men who told them to draw, then damned them for doing so. Their sketches were not field guides. They were warnings, not to others, but to themselves, to remember what they had seen. Because when a priest draws a devil, he is purging him. But when a woman does it, she is hosting him, carrying him, becoming him. And the only cure for that was fire. In the final scene of this act, we'll gather what's left, the scattered pages, the faded margins, the trembling lines. We'll ask what survived, what was spared, and how these fragile scraps became something more than history, how they became testimony, not of sin, but of vision and of the right to draw what haunts you. Some pages were never meant to survive. They were tucked between covers that no longer close, pressed into spines broken by centuries, folded inside cloaks, buried beneath floorboards, or left in rooms whose doors had long since warped with rain. And yet, they are still here. Faint, flaking, forgotten by the world that condemned them, but not by time. These are the pages that wouldn't burn, the ones drawn by women, copied, erased, redrawn, and erased again, but never fully gone. Not entirely. They whisper from their glass cases, from the margins of manuscripts mislabeled, from the smudge that won't quite fade. They should have been lost, but somehow they linger. We begin with a psalter in Ghent. Its provenance is uncertain. So is its authorship. But it contains a curious illumination. Mary Magdalene kneeling beside a tree. Her robe is pale red, her hair loose, her face unfinished, or so it seems. Scholars once believed the image was damaged, but under infrared scan, the faint lines reappear. The face was removed, not lost, scraped away with a knife. The original lines remain below, hidden in the fibers. And what do they show? Not a saint. A woman, older than the usual Magdalene. Eyes not cast down in shame, but forward, level, meeting yours. Unrepentant, unashamed. The hand that drew her is unknown, but the brush strokes, the pigment choices, the particular way the fingers rest on the tree, they suggest a woman, trained, careful, and too bold. In Bologna, there survives a single leaf, torn from a book of hours. It contains a marginalia scene, a nun sewing the mouth of a devil shut. The devil grins through the thread. The nun looks away. At first glance, it's playful, a joke, but the devil's face is familiar, and the nun's posture, her elbow raised, her spine rigid, mirrors the standard pose of St. Catherine. A parody? A protest? A memory? We do not know. There is no signature, no caption, only that it was trimmed from its original folio, tucked into the back of an unrelated codex, bound backward, as though someone tried to keep it, but also tried not to be caught with it. It now rests in a rare book's room, catalogued simply as fragmentary margin, possible allegorical content. The patterns repeat, drawings hidden, removed, altered, but not entirely lost. In a convent in what was once Lorraine, a ledger was discovered during repairs in the 1800s. It had been used to track eggs and wool, but between the pages were unbound sheets, paintings small, crude, in faded reds and browns. They depict women, not saints, not devils, just women. One washes her feet in a basin. One lies beneath a tree, eyes open to the stars. One presses her hand to her chest as a bird lands on her arm. Each wears a similar expression, still, alert, exhausted, and in the corner of each page, the same symbol appears. A circle, a leaf, a hand, sometimes all three, drawn small enough to be missed or remembered. No name is attached, but in the ledger is a list of chores beside a name scratched again and again. Alma. It means soul. Sometimes the survival was accidental. ink that seeped into vellum too deeply to erase, gold that proved too stubborn to scrape, a prayer book rebound without noticing what lay beneath the paste-down, a trial record misfiled under theology, a demon drawn in the corner of a catechism whose tail doesn't match the rest because it was added by a different hand. Later, silently, we have evidence, not enough, but enough to see the shape of what once was, like fossil imprints in stone, like smoke traces on a ceiling long after the fire. And yet, some were spared, deliberately, by other women, by scribes who knew what it meant to draw with caution, by archivists who chose not to correct the mistakes, by collectors who understood the power of silence. In a private collection in Prague, there is a Book of Hours. It has no provenance, but one folio shows the visitation, Mary and Elizabeth embracing, and in the folds of their robes, the words, "Blessed are the women who remember." Not from Scripture, not part of any standard rubric. The phrase is scratched so lightly into the paint that it was only discovered under magnification, added after the fact, hidden in plain sight. The archivist who found it did not remove it. He circled it in pencil, and beside it, in a careful modern hand, he wrote, "Let this remain." We often think of survival as strength, but sometimes it's just softness, flexibility, ink soaking into a page too deeply to scrub, paint layered so thin that even erasure leaves a ghost, a drawing so small it escapes attention, a flower so familiar no one questions it, until they look closely, until they realize it has 13 petals. Sometimes survival is not loud. It is not heroic. It is just there. A page that wasn't burned. A line that wasn't crossed out. A woman who wasn't believed, but wasn't entirely forgotten either. And what do we do with these remnants? Do we call them art, heritage, accident, proof? Or do we do what we've always done, read too much into them, or not enough? Assign meaning, assign blame, assign names to women who never signed their work, because they weren't allowed to, because they were taught not to, because they were protecting themselves, or someone else? Perhaps all we can do is hold the paper. Let it speak. Let it not speak. Let it remain. We call this history, but it is also mourning, a mourning for what was lost, for what was made and never seen, for what was never allowed to begin, but also a gratitude that some part of them remains, not the woman, perhaps, but the shape of her thought, the flicker of her brush, the moment she pressed her hand to the page and let it remember her. These are not masterpieces. They are fragments, and that makes them no less holy. In the next and final act, we pass into the hollow space they left behind, into the silence that followed, into the myths, legends, and questions that rose in their absence. We ask, what was learned from the women who drew the devil? And what, quietly, secretly, did they draw in return? Because even the blankest pages remember the shape of what was almost there, and even the smallest line, in the right light, can still burn. This is the threshold, where silence becomes architecture, where absence is louder than any word that was ever allowed, where what should have been drawn never was. Not every story was told. Not every line was drawn. Some were stopped before they began, not erased, but never permitted to exist. This is the other kind of silence. Not the quiet of a closed chapel, not the hush of a secret, but a silence carved deliberately into space, into paper, into memory. It is the silence of absence, of warning, of erasure, and of all the women who never got to draw at all. Let us begin with a manuscript, or rather, the ghost of one, held now in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, catalogued as Miss Lat 1178. It is a partial psalter, half illuminated, half blank, not worn, not unfinished, just stopped. The first 60 folios are vivid, gold leaf halos, vermilion margins, stylized birds roosting in the curls of calligraphy. Then, suddenly, nothing. No damage, no soot or rot, just white pages, prepared but untouched. Their smoothness almost aggressive, a refusal. Scholars disagree on why. Some suggest war interrupted the scriptorium. Others think the commission ran out of funding. But tucked into a marginal note, on folio 59 recto, there is one strange phrase. Sororis manus dimissa est. The sister's hand was dismissed. Dismissed, not dead, not missing, not transferred. Dismissed. What hand? What sister? Her name is not recorded, but the style of the early illuminations, light, unforced, warm, matches other manuscripts known to have come from convent workshops, the kind run by women, silently, skillfully, until someone said, "Stop." And what followed was not correction, not replacement, just white, as if no one dared fill the space she left, as if to do so might say too much. These are the blank pages that haunt archives. Not accidental, not forgotten, deliberate, sanctioned. Blank not because no one was there, but because someone was told to disappear. In German monastic ledgers from the 14th century, you'll find lists of pigments purchased, parchments scraped, brushes trimmed, and sometimes lines drawn through names. One sister, Agatha, is listed for 11 months, her notations precise, her ink measurements careful. Then her name is struck. No explanation, no successor noted. But following that, 10 empty pages, each one prepared, ruled, and left unmarked. Was it grief? Fear? Punishment? Did she draw something too beautiful? Too strange? Too true? There are walls like this too. Chapel frescoes that begin with saints and end with blank plaster. A Madonna with unfinished fingers. An angel's wing without a face to guard. Pigment scraped back to stone. Not painted over, but peeled away. A careful forgetting. In one convent in Umbria, a 15th century mural once showed a vision of revelation. The 4 horsemen, a rain of stars, a woman clothed in the sun. Only the stars remain. The woman is gone. Chisel marks where her robe should be. Dust where her eyes once were. The inscription beneath still reads, Et vidi mulierem, and I saw a woman. and nothing more. What do we call these voids? Gaps? Losses? Or warnings? Because every blank page left in a book of hours was a page where someone might have drawn, might have spoken, might have painted something that could not be tolerated. And so the safest thing, the holy thing, was to leave it blank. Absence became virtue. White space became obedience. The less you said, the more you were trusted. And that is how history hollowed. Not with fire, but with silence. Aloud, repeated, blessed. This is where we grieve not what was destroyed, but what was prevented. The sketches never begun. The apprentices never accepted. The brushes never handed down. The pigments never mixed. The notebooks never filled. In the rule books of several Cistercian orders, you will find a sentence repeated often: "No sister shall engage in illumination unless instructed by the abbot." But many houses had no abbot, only a visiting prior, a man who came once a month, if at all. So the rule became a lock, and the lock needed no key. Just a reminder: you do not draw until you are told to, and no one is coming to tell you. Sometimes it went deeper, to the body, to the mind. Inquisition records describe women who confessed not to what they had drawn, but to what they had wanted to draw. One said she dreamed of painting Christ's hands, not his face, not his cross, just the hands, because they looked like her father's prestants, because she missed him, because it brought her peace. The inquisitor asked if the hands had bled. She said no. He wrote, "Vision incomplete, temptation suppressed," and sent her home. No drawing was ever made, but the absence of it is recorded. These are the silences we rarely study, the hollowings, the preemptive forgettings, the art that trembled at the edge of becoming, but never dared arrive. They do not live in museums. You cannot hold them, only imagine them. And in imagining them, you begin to hear the echo: what might she have made? Who might she have become? There are no answers, but the questions remain. And yet, the hollowed spaces are not always empty. They absorb, they whisper, they collect us, they ask us to look anyway. A blank page in a manuscript becomes a place to breathe, to wonder, to see not just what is there, but what was not allowed to be. And in doing so, to recognize that absence can be louder than presence. That silence, when chosen for you, becomes a kind of noise. So we listen to the nothing, to the stillness, to the hands that hovered above the parchment, but were told not to move, to the brushes that dried without pigment, to the fingers that traced images only on air. And we say their names, if we know them, and we say something when we don't, because even the women who never drew deserve to be seen, in the shape of what they never got to make. In the next scene, we return from the hollow. We will visit those rare places where defiance outlived fear, where a few women did draw, did sign, did survive, and were almost forgotten, but not quite. We will meet them in the closing light, the last witnesses, the ones who left behind full pages, full figures, full voices. the ones who drew the devil and lived long enough to call him by name. This is the return from silence. A brief, bright window where a few women reached through fear, through doctrine, through centuries of vanishing, and left us their names. We speak often of the women who were silenced, but what of the ones who weren't? Or, not entirely? What of the ones who slipped past the erasure, not by hiding, but by signing? Their names are few, faint, sometimes buried beneath centuries of misattribution, sometimes whispered only in footnotes, but they are there. And their work not just survived, it lived. It looked back, it spoke, and in its corner, in thin but deliberate ink, it said, "I was here." Let us begin in Bavaria. The year is 1326. A Benedictine nun named Guda kneels over vellum, brush in hand. She is not young. Her joints ache, but her lines are steady. She is illuminating a self-portrait. She paints her own face, round, lined, unsmiling. She wears her veil. She holds a scroll. On it, Guda peccatrix mulier scripsit et pinxit. Guda, a sinful woman, wrote and painted this. She calls herself a sinner, because it is safer that way. But still, she signs it. In full Latin, in the sacred script usually reserved for male scribes. Not hidden, not coded, declared. Her portrait now lives in the Frankfurt Stadtbibliothek. It is rarely displayed, but it is there, and she is still watching us. Next, we move to 12th century England. The Ancrene Wissy, a guide for female recluses, was likely written by a man, but marginal notes in one of its earliest manuscripts, now in Oxford, suggest otherwise. In its blank corners, in the spaces between the prayers, a second hand appears, careful, untrained, but persistent. It records the name Leoba twice, and once, Leoba scribat ut memoriam suam tenet. Let Leoba write, so her memory may hold. No one knows who she was. A scribe? A reader? A recluse? A nun whose training wasn't supposed to include ink? But she wrote, and in that tiny rebellion, she became permanent. There are others. In Germany, a woman named Clarissa swings from the tail of a capital letter Q, a self-portrait hidden in flourish. She holds a book in one hand, her hair uncovered, a scandalous detail for a nun. Her name appears below her feet, playful, brazen, alive. In northern Spain, the Codex Las Huelgas, a collection of polyphonic music from the early 1300s, bears not only the voices of nuns, but the corrections of them, lines scratched out and rewritten, mistakes fixed, voices made sharper. They sang, they edited, they instructed, and though the music is anonymous, it carries the rhythm of a female hand, confident, measured, unmistakable. These women did not escape danger. Many lived under threat, under surveillance, under the shadow of a doctrine that found female knowledge, at best, suspicious, at worst, infernal. But they left traces anyway, some in full names, some in symbols, some in silence broken only once, on one page, in one line of script that says, gently but clearly, I did this. And that, in their world, was an act of defiance, even of survival. Even the signatures are rarely whole. Often, they come with caveats, peccatrix, indigna, a poor hand. These women knew how to soften their truth, how to excuse their talent, how to appear small while doing something immense. But the ink doesn't lie. Their work holds. The lines hold. The pigment, faded but clinging, holds. And through it, we hear them. Still modest, still sharp, still here. Some even drew boldly. There is a French book of hours from the 14th century, housed now in a Belgian collection. In its margins, a woman rides a lion. She holds a mirror. She is nude. She is smiling. Beside her, barely visible, a name has been etched into the ink with a pin. Jean. Who was she? A scribe? A noblewoman with too much leisure? A nun with too little patience? We do not know. But the image remains. The name remains. Etched not in ink, but scratched deep enough into parchment to leave a dent, so deep that no paint could cover it. We must speak, too, of women who signed not their name, but their gaze, artists who did not write, "I was here," but drew faces that could not have been painted by anyone else. A Madonna with crow's feet, a saint with the bent shoulders of grief, a devil who looks tired instead of triumphant. These are the signatures you feel before you see. Not bold, not proud, but unmistakable. The kind of honesty that ink cannot hide. And sometimes, in the corner of the page, a flower, 13 petals. You've seen it before. Why does this matter? Because history often forgets what it doesn't understand. And it has never known what to do with women who leave things behind. Not confessions, not births, not recipes, but work, thought, imagination, art, made not in secret, but in plain view, made not for others, but for themselves. It mattered that they signed, not because we needed proof, but because they knew someone, someday, would look back, would want to find them, and would need that name like a candle. So here they are, Gouda, Claricia, Leoba, Jean, and dozens more, whose names we may never know, but whose marks we feel, in a curve, in a smudge, in a line that says, this face is not a fantasy. This figure is real. This devil is mine. This saint is not still. This brushstroke was not permissioned. It was chosen. It was drawn. And it remains. In our final scene, we return one last time to the question that haunts this entire story. What did it mean for a woman to draw the devil? What did it cost? What did it give back? And what is left behind in the smoke, in the parchment, in the darkness she dared illustrate with her own hand? Because some images are too powerful to disappear, and some names, once written, can never be fully erased. This is the last threshold, the final line drawn, and the face behind the devil finally seen. She wasn't supposed to draw him, not because it was forbidden, though it was, not because it was dangerous, though it was, but because they had already drawn him for her. They had painted his teeth, carved his claws, outlined his shadow in woodblock, pigment, scripture. They had told her what to fear, and what not to touch, and what never to look at too closely, lest it begin to look like her. But still, one day, she sat down, alone, and she drew. We do not know her name. We do not know the date. Only that a single folio remains, not catalogued, not displayed, but preserved by accident in the back matter of a theological commentary, found centuries later, pressed against a blank page that still smells faintly of ash. The image is faded, but unmistakable. A figure, crouched, winged, yes, but the wings are worn, heavy, earthly. One hand touches the ground, the other touches its own face. There are no horns, no fire, no tail, just a woman, tired, looking sideways, half shadowed, half recognizable. There is no signature, only a single word written in the bottom corner, ego, I-ek, me. It's not boastful, not theatrical. It does not scream. It does not warn. It simply says, this is mine. I drew this, and I am still here. She does not draw the devil as they taught her. No grotesque, no beast, no lascivious tyrant of flesh and shadow. She draws him as weariness, as sorrow, as memory. The kind of devil that doesn't visit at midnight, but at dawn, when the fire is low and the ink is nearly gone. This is not seduction, not blasphemy. This is not a pact. It is a portrait of her fear, of her anger, of the things she could not say out loud, but could say with a line. Because sometimes, to survive, a woman had to give the devil a face, her own. What was she accused of? We do not know. No trial records mention her. No ledger lists her pigments. No scribe writes her down as sorer, or peccatrix, or defendenda. She exists only here, in one image, one line, one word, ego. And in that image, everything burns quiet, not with fire, but with recognition of a soul too tired to be holy and too honest to lie. Why did she draw it? To confess? To resist? To remember? Perhaps all of these. Perhaps none. Perhaps she drew because the devil was not in the room, but in the silence that followed it. In the blankness of pages she wasn't allowed to fill. In the tremble of the brush she was told to put down. Perhaps she drew him not because he came to her, but because he came from her, because that was the only way to get him out. This is not history with answers. It is history with a question mark, curled like a tail. It is the whisper in the archive, the gap in the ledger, the smudge on the vellum. But in that smudge, you see her, just for a moment, not screaming, not saintly, not perfect, just human, just tired, just drawing, her devil. And that is the thing they feared most. Not that she worshipped evil, but that she understood it, that she could draw it without trembling, that she could admit that it looked a little like her and a little like them, that she wasn't trying to summon the devil. She was trying to survive him, trying to name what haunted her, so it would stop chasing her shadow, trying to trap him in a line, trying to make him less. And when she was done, what then? Did she hide it? Leave it behind? Was she afraid? Did she hope someone, someday, would see it and understand? Or did she already know that even if the world never believed her, the page would? That the vellum, at least, would not twist her words, would not call her monstrous for seeing monsters, would not punish her for honesty. That's the quiet miracle of the image, that it exists, that she dared to say, "This is the devil," and dared to mean, "This is how he looks to me." Not to you, not to the court, not to the church. To me. We call this scene a conclusion, but it isn't, because there are still pages we haven't found, still pigments under dust, still women who drew something once and folded it tightly and placed it where no one would think to look. And maybe someone will find it, and maybe they won't, but the drawing happened. The hand moved, the line was made, and that is enough. Because in the end, the devil she drew was not the churches, not the inquisitors, not the theologians, not even the world's planks daughters. He was hers, and once she drew him, he was no longer in charge. She was.